The late afternoon sun bathed the stained glass windows of St. Teresa's Church in a soft, golden light, bringing the intricate designs to life. For the small town of Crestwood, the church had always been a place of refuge and comfort. At its core was Pastor Elijah Stoker, a man deeply respected by his congregation for his steadfast faith and endless compassion. Elijah, now in his late 40s, had eyes that reflected the many years he had spent comforting those who came to him for guidance. As he did every Sunday, he stood at the pulpit today, delivering a sermon that touched the hearts of everyone in the congregation. Elijah's voice was steady and calm, carrying the weight of someone who truly believed he was on a mission from above. As he spoke about love, forgiveness, and finding redemption, his eyes would sometimes wander to the back of the church. There, a young girl sat by herself, her head lowered. Abigail Marlowe, a regular at St. Teresa's, was a quiet 17-year-old with dark hair that gently framed her pale face. Lila was known for being quiet and reserved, often staying in the background. But Elijah had noticed her consistent attendance at every service. The church had become a safe haven for her, and Elijah initially saw her as just another person seeking comfort and direction. He noticed how she often stayed behind after services, her eyes reflecting a quiet yearning for something or someone to fill the emptiness in her life. One Sunday, after the congregation had left, he approached her with a few kind words and a willingness to listen. Though she was initially reserved, Elijah's gentle manner gradually started to dismantle the barriers she had put up around herself. They began meeting regularly after services. Initially, their talks centered around faith and life, with Elijah offering Lila guidance and encouragement. He reassured her that God had a plan for everyone, even for those who felt lost and alone. As the weeks passed, their talks became more personal. Elijah began to feel an unexpected and uncomfortable attraction to Lila. Her vulnerability stirred something deep within him, awakening a protective, almost fatherly instinct. Beneath that protective instinct, there was a darker urge that Elijah had never admitted to himself. Lila, in turn, felt a bond with Elijah that she couldn't quite grasp. His kindness was unlike anything she had ever experienced. He listened to her, showed genuine concern, and made her feel important. She started to eagerly anticipate their meetings, appreciating the warmth in his eyes when he spoke and the gentle touch of his hand on her shoulder as he offered comfort. One Sunday, after the church had emptied and they were alone in the sanctuary, Elijah and Lila found themselves together in that quiet space. Elijah moved closer to Lila, his heart racing. The lines between his role as her pastor and something darker were becoming increasingly unclear. Gently, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper, "Lila, I want you to know you're not alone." "You're special and deserving of love," Elijah said. Lila looked up at him, her eyes wide with a blend of confusion and desire. She had never heard such words before, especially not from someone like Elijah. It was at that moment that the affair started. What began as a small, barely noticeable change in their relationship quickly developed into something they both knew was wrong but couldn't seem to stop. They began meeting in secret, finding quiet spots in the church to be away from anyone who might notice. Their meetings were fleeting and intense, leaving them both breathless and grappling with a blend of guilt and desire. Elijah convinced himself he was helping Lila, that she needed him in ways that went beyond the spiritual. Yet deep down he knew he was crossing a boundary that could never be undone. Lila, meanwhile, was increasingly consumed by the passion of their forbidden affair, her feelings for Elijah deepening with each day. As the sun set over St. Teresa's Church, casting long shadows across the tranquil town of Crestwood, a dark secret was growing within its walls, one that would soon bring about unimaginable tragedy. Gregory Shale, the church's janitor for more than 20 years, arrived as he always did before dawn, carrying a thermos of coffee and a quiet respect for the sacred space he cared for. Gregory was a creature of habit, his days defined by a steady routine. However, as he approached the church that morning, something felt unusual. The front door, which he had locked tightly the night before, was slightly open, its heavy wooden frame creaking faintly in the gentle breeze. A frown etched itself onto Gregory's face as he stepped inside, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence of the empty church. When he reached Elijah's office, he saw the door was slightly ajar. His hand paused on the doorknob, a sense of dread tightening in his chest. But Gregory was a practical man, and he pushed the door open. His breath caught in his throat as he saw the scene before him. Pastor Elijah lay on the floor, his body contorted awkwardly. His once kind eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, lifeless and empty. Blood had pooled around his head, dark and thick, soaking into the rich burgundy carpet. The room was in disarray, with papers strewn across the floor, a lamp shattered near the desk, and the sharp scent of blood heavy in the air. For a moment, Gregory stood frozen, his mind struggling to grasp the horror before him. The man who had once been a pillar of their community, offering comfort and guidance to so many, was now a lifeless body on the cold floor of his own office. Gregory stumbled back, his hand shaking as he reached for the phone on the desk, dialing the emergency number with trembling fingers. When the police arrived, the small churchyard quickly filled with the flashing lights of patrol cars and the murmurs of hushed voices. Detective Nita Raymond was among the first to arrive, her keen eyes quickly absorbing every detail as she entered the office. Renowned for her meticulous nature and her talent for noticing what others might miss, she surveyed the room with a composed expression. Inside, her mind was already working to piece together the puzzle before her. Pastor Elijah's body was a grim sight, his blood forming a dark halo on the floor. Nita observed the signs of a struggle: an overturned chair, a blood-spattered desk, and a torn curtain hanging limply in the corner. This was no simple death, it was violent and personal. Whoever had committed this crime had intended for Elijah to suffer. As the forensic team began their work, dusting for fingerprints and collecting evidence, Nita's gaze was drawn to a partially burnt photograph on the edge of the desk. She picked it up with care, observing that it showed Elijah with his arm around a young woman, her face almost entirely obscured by the charred edges. It was a curious find, suggesting a connection that remained hidden. Moments later, Rachel Stoker, Elijah's estranged wife, arrived, her face pale and drawn as she pushed through the crowd. Notified by a neighbor, she had rushed to the scene, her mind racing with questions and fears. When Rachel saw the police tape and the solemn faces of the officers, her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Gregory hadn't caught her in time. Tears filled her eyes as the reality hit: Elijah was dead, and nothing would ever be the same. The news of Pastor Elijah's death spread through Crestwood quickly, leaving a trail of grief and confusion in its wake. St. Teresa's Church, once a symbol of hope and faith, was now the scene of a gruesome murder. The town was left in shock, its residents grappling with the contrast between their beloved pastor and the violent end he had met. As Detective Nita Raymond observed the unfolding scene, she knew this case would be anything but straightforward. There were hidden truths here, truths that had led to a man's death, and it was her responsibility to uncover them, no matter the consequences. Detective Nita Raymond stood in the dimly lit office of St. Teresa's Church, feeling the seriousness of the situation. The finding of Pastor Elijah Stoker's body had stunned Crestwood, and now it was up to Nita to find out what really happened. As she examined the room, her analytical mind started to connect the initial clues. However, she understood that this case would need more than just observation. It would require a thorough exploration of the private lives of those nearest to the pastor. The first task in the investigation was to create a timeline. Nita needed to find out when Elijah was last seen alive and who had been with him. Gregory Shale, the church janitor, reported that he had locked up the church around 9 p.m. the night before. Elijah had mentioned to Gregory that he would stay a bit longer to finish up some work, which was a common occurrence. However, by morning, Elijah's body was found, cold and lifeless. Nita's next step was to speak with people who knew Elijah well. Rachel Stoker, Elijah's estranged wife, was a logical place to begin. Their relationship had been troubled for years, and there were plenty of rumors in town about their ongoing marital problems. Nita visited Rachel at the Stokers' modest home, where the tension was palpable. Rachel, a woman in her early 40s, had a weary look in her eyes that hinted at years of unhappiness. As Nita interviewed her, Rachel's responses were deliberate and seemed somewhat rehearsed. Rachel confessed that she and Elijah had been living separate lives under the same roof just to maintain appearances. Their relationship had deteriorated to the point where their marriage was merely a formality. "I knew he was distant, but I never imagined something like this would happen," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was still a good man, despite everything," Rachel said. Nita observed the way Rachel spoke about Elijah. There was a blend of sadness and resignation in her tone. However, there was also an underlying bitterness that suggested unresolved anger. Rachel had an alibi for the time of Elijah's death. She had been at a friend's house across town, and this was quickly confirmed. However, Nita couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel was concealing something. Nita then focused on Lila Marlowe, the teenage girl who had been spending an unusual amount of time with Elijah. Lila was brought in for questioning at the local police station, her small frame seeming even smaller in the cold, sterile environment. She kept her eyes down, avoiding Nita's gaze. "Lila, I know this is difficult, but I need to understand your relationship with Pastor Elijah," Nita began, her tone gentle yet firm. Lila hesitated, nervously fidgeting with her hands in her lap. He was just helping me," she said softly. "I didn't have anyone else to talk to." "What kind of help?" Nita pressed, her gaze steady. Lila looked up, her eyes revealing a mix of fear and what Nita recognized as guilt. "He was kind to me," Lila admitted. "He listened when no one else would." "We became close." "How close?" Nita asked, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of tension. Lila swallowed hard, her face going pale. We had a relationship," she whispered, her words barely audible. "But it wasn't like that at first." "I didn't mean for it to happen," Lila said softly. Nita leaned back in her chair, taking in the gravity of Lila's confession. The relationship between Elijah and Lila was a crucial piece of the puzzle, adding further complexity to the investigation. This wasn't merely a case of a murdered pastor. It was a tangled web of secrets and lies, with Lila at the center. As Nita continued her questioning, it became evident that Lila had been profoundly affected by her involvement with Elijah. Young and vulnerable, she had clearly been manipulated by someone in a position of power. Whether Lila's relationship with Elijah had motivated someone to murder him, or if Lila herself had a darker role to play, remained unclear. With the initial interviews finished, Nita realized she had only scratched the surface. There were still many people to question and more secrets to uncover. The evidence gathered from the crime scene, such as the burnt photograph, suggested deeper connections and hidden motives. As Nita left the station, her mind was racing with possibilities. She was determined to uncover the truth behind the facade of the small town and its respected pastor. The investigation into Pastor Elijah Stoker's murder was gaining momentum, and Detective Nita Raymond knew it was time to focus on the primary suspects. The first suspect on Nita's list was Rachel Stoker, Elijah's estranged wife. Although Rachel had an alibi, Nita couldn't overlook the deep-seated resentment Rachel had toward Elijah. Their marriage had been deteriorating for years, something Rachel had confessed during their initial interview. But Nita needed to determine whether that resentment had escalated into something more sinister. She returned to Rachel's home, seeking further insight into her relationship with Elijah. As Nita sat across from Rachel in the small, cluttered living room, she noticed the tension in Rachel's posture and the way she twisted her hands nervously in her lap. "Rachel, I need you to be honest with me," Nita began, her voice steady. "What was your relationship with Elijah like in the days leading up to his death?" Rachel's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and perhaps a hint of guilt. "It was the same as it had been for years," she said quietly. "We barely spoke. We were like strangers living under the same roof." "Did you ever confront him about the other women?" Nita asked, carefully observing Rachel's reaction. Rachel's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I knew he was unfaithful," she admitted, her voice tinged with bitterness. "But I didn't have the strength to confront him. I suppose I just learned to live with it." Nita nodded, absorbing Rachel's words. The bitterness was evident, but was it enough to push Rachel to murder? Nita wasn't convinced. Rachel seemed more resigned than vengeful, more heartbroken than furious. Still, Nita made a mental note to keep Rachel on the list of suspects. The next person of interest was Lila Marlowe, the teenage girl involved in a secret affair with Elijah. Lila's confession had shocked Nita, but it also left her with even more questions. How had a vulnerable young girl like Lila become involved with a man like Elijah? And what had compelled Lila to continue the relationship, even as it clearly weighed on her conscience? To gain a better understanding of Lila's home life, Nita arranged to meet her parents, Harold and Abigail Marlowe. The Marlowes were a devout couple, well known in the community for their active involvement in church activities. When Nita arrived at their home, she was struck by the stark contrast between the Marlowes' outward piety and the troubled daughter they had raised. "Detective, I don't understand how any of this could have happened," Abigail said, her voice trembling as she poured tea for Nita. Lila was always such a good girl. We raised her to be respectful, to follow the teachings of the church. But did you notice any changes in Lila's behavior over the past few months?" Nita asked, accepting the cup of tea. Harold Marlowe, a stern-looking man with deep-set eyes, frowned deeply. She became distant. He admitted, "We thought it was just teenage rebellion. She started spending more time alone and didn't want to talk to us as much. We had no idea she was involved with Pastor Elijah. Do you think Lila could have heard Elijah?" Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nita considered the question carefully. Lila was emotionally fragile, and her relationship with Elijah had clearly affected her deeply. However, Nita wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. "At this point, we're exploring all possibilities," she said diplomatically. But it's too early to say. As Nita left the Marlowe home, her thoughts remained focused on Lila. It was clear that the girl had been manipulated by Elijah, but had Lila been desperate enough, or pushed far enough, to take Elijah's life? Or was there someone else who had discovered the affair and decided to act on their own? The final suspect on Nita's radar was Marcus Pritchard, a deacon at St. Teresa's Church and a close friend of Elijah's. Known for his strict moral code and unwavering dedication to the church, Marcus had also been the subject of community whispers about clashes with Elijah over certain undisclosed issues. Nita decided to visit Marcus, meeting him at the church office. Marcus was a tall, imposing man with a stern expression that rarely softened. As Nita questioned him about his relationship with Elijah, Marcus's responses were clipped and his tone defensive. "Elijah and I had our disagreements," Marcus admitted, his voice cold, "but nothing that would lead to this. I respected him as a man of God. Despite our differences, did you know about his relationship with Lila?" Nita asked, closely watching Marcus's reaction. Marcus's expression darkened. "I suspected something was going on," he said, his voice tense. "But I didn't have proof. If I had known, I would have confronted him. What he did was a betrayal of everything we stood for," Marcus said. As Nita left the church, her mind was buzzing with possibilities. Each suspect had a motive and a reason to want Elijah dead, but the crucial question remained: who had actually committed the murder, and why? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the full picture was still elusive. Detective Nita Raymond sat in her car, the engine idling as she reviewed the evidence collected so far. She knew she was close, too close to overlook any detail. The suspects had motives, but something crucial was missing: a piece that would directly link one of them to the crime. That's when it hit her: the burnt photograph found near Elijah's body. Initially dismissed as an oddity or a remnant of the church's clutter, the burnt photograph now took on new significance. The edges were singed, but Nita could make out a pair of hands in the corner of a distinct bracelet, a bracelet she had seen before. Nita drove straight to the Marlowe residence. When Abigail Marlowe opened the door, Nita's eyes were immediately drawn to the bracelet on her wrist. It was the same intricate silver design from the photograph. "Mrs. Marlowe, I need to speak with you," and Lila immediately, Nita said, her voice firm with authority. In the living room, with Abigail and Lila seated nervously before her, Nita presented the partially burnt photograph. "This was found near Pastor Elijah's body," Nita explained, closely observing their reactions. Abigail's face went pale, her hand instinctively covering her wrist. "Why do you have this photograph, Mrs. Marlowe?" Nita pressed. Abigail hesitated, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It was from a counseling session," she stammered. "Elijah kept it as a reminder. But I don't know how it ended up like that," Abigail said. Nita knew she was on the right track. "Did you know about the affair between Elijah and Lila?" she asked directly, shifting her gaze between mother and daughter. Abigail broke down, tears streaming down her face. "I suspected it," she admitted. "But when I confronted Elijah, he denied it. He said it was just innocent mentoring." Lila, who had been silent, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Mom tried to burn the photo that night. After they argued, she revealed. She said it would end everything, but I didn't know what she meant." Nita's mind raced. The burned photograph was crucial evidence, indicating that Abigail had confronted Elijah. The confrontation had likely escalated, leading to violence. Nita could see it clearly now. Abigail, overwhelmed by betrayal and anger, had lashed out, with rage clouding her judgment. "Abigail," Nita said softly, "did you confront Elijah again after that night?" Abigail's shoulders slumped, and she nodded slowly. "I went to the church," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt him, but he wouldn't listen. He kept denying it, lying to my face. I just lost control, Abigail confessed. With that, Nita knew she had found her killer. Abigail Marlowe had taken justice into her own hands. The truth was devastating, but also the final piece of the puzzle. With Abigail Marlowe's confession, Detective Nita Raymond moved swiftly to secure a warrant for her arrest. The news of Abigail's arrest spread rapidly through the small town, sending shockwaves through the community. The woman known for her devout faith was now facing charges for the murder of Pastor Elijah Stoker. The trial began within weeks, drawing intense public interest. The prosecution portrayed Abigail as a woman driven to madness by the betrayal of her husband and daughter, arguing that her actions were premeditated. They presented the burnt photograph, the confrontation at the church, and her own confession as irrefutable evidence of her guilt. In contrast, the defense argued that Abigail had been pushed to the brink by Elijah's manipulation and deceit, claiming that she had acted in a moment of temporary insanity. The defense portrayed Abigail as a victim of emotional abuse, someone who had simply snapped under unbearable pressure. The courtroom was tense as the jury deliberated, weighing the evidence and testimonies. When they returned with a verdict, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. "Guilty," the foreman announced, his voice resonating through the silent courtroom. Abigail Marlowe was sentenced to life in prison, her once respected life shattered by the crime. For Detective Nita Raymond, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but at a heavy cost. The conviction of Abigail Marlowe sent ripples through the town, leaving the community grappling with the harsh reality. Hey, truth and crime case solvers, interested in more real-life murder mysteries? Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Do you have any thoughts about this case or a case of your own you'd like us to investigate? Leave us a comment. Until then, stay safe.